scoring systems.
Scoring systems are integral to shmups. The genre developed them more than any other. They add depth to games by giving players a ton of nuances to learn, along with clear, constantly shifting goals. They create dynamic difficulty by having players take on greater challenges as they get better, and they make games more engaging on a moment-to-moment basis by giving players more to consider, think about, and execute. Scoring systems often add a layer of resource management to the games or give existing resource management more meaning. They connect different encounters into a cohesive whole and give players long-term goals to work on, beyond surviving the patterns. For example, Ketsu's enemy multiplier and Esgaluda's gems are finite resources that players have to manage and spend strategically, because different enemies and screens have different scoring potential. Battle Garegga and Armored Police Batrider have whole resource economies, where survival, power-ups, and bombs make the game harder, but let you score more, while scoring gives you lives that can be used for strategic suicides, which in turn lower the difficulty. Those suicides themselves can also be used for scoring purposes, creating a loop. So you can see how the dynamic difficulty, the scoring, and every other element of the game feeds into each other and create like this kind of developing snowball of gameplay. Even if you as a developer have no interest in adding and fleshing out scoring systems, you must understand what they bring to the table and figure out good ways to recreate it by other means.
Building a scoring system.
When creating scoring systems, it's good to think of them as sets of conflicting goals and priorities, which feed into each other in the long term. This is what makes scoring systems dynamic and deep. It forces players to make decisions and plan ahead. The most basic example of this conflict is between scoring and survival. Players want to stay safe to survive, but scoring forces them to go out of their way and do risky stuff to reach secondary objectives. These conflicting goals exist within scoring systems as well. For example, if your scoring is item-based, it may be impossible to grab every single item the game can spawn, forcing players to decide which items to prioritize. Because it takes time to reposition, those choices may affect which items are grabbable in the very next part of the level. If your game uses finite resources for scoring, players will have to figure out where to optimally use them. The fact that players can't have everything forces them to approach the games more thoughtfully. This should be obvious, but you want to make sure your game doesn't let the player infinitely milk certain spots for score by giving bosses timers, limiting how many times enemies can respawn, and making sure the players can't gain lives quicker than they lose them in checkpoint-based games.
Incentives and tangibility.
Scoring on its own can be a rather abstract minigame, which is detached from most in-game objects. The more detached the scoring systems are, the more arbitrary they will feel. To counter this, games try to make scoring elements more tangible. They try to build scoring around natural incentives, and match them to what players think corresponds with playing well. Incentives are natural or intuitive when they take advantage of behaviors that follow from the rules of the game, such as killing enemies quickly to minimize danger, grabbing all shiny items, that kind of stuff. The more in line with the rules of the game your incentives are, the less arbitrary they will feel. Here's an analogy to make it simpler. Going fast to increase your score in a racing game will feel natural. Going in circles at the starting line to build up a multiplier or something will not. One builds on the regular goals of the gameplay, the other introduces a whole new mini-game into the mix. Things like shiny coins and big numbers are ways to make the scoring feel more tangible. By representing scoring objects with items players will naturally want to grab, you line up what the player wants to do and what you want them to do. Even more detached scoring systems like the one in Dodonpachi use a quote-unquote natural desire to see big flashing numbers grow as an incentive for scoring. Caravan-style games like Soldier Blade and Danganronpa take advantage of the player's desire to kill enemies quickly and efficiently by rewarding quick kills with even more enemy spawns and thus more score. Whenever you're playing a game and getting a lot of points just viscerally feels good, that's when you know the game lined up the natural incentives with its scoring systems really well. The ideal scoring system from a communication perspective is one that players fall into without thinking. They'll just naturally start scoring, just because the incentives are nicely lined up. It's a system where players can gauge their performance without looking at any numbers at all.
Linear versus exponential systems.
Linear versus exponential are two categories that scoring systems fall into. They should be viewed more as metaphors rather than taken literally. Linear scoring systems are very straightforward. You kill an enemy or pick up a scoring item, you get a set number of points. Typically, these scoring systems have little to no punishment for missing any individual enemy or scoring item. Once things like multipliers, big cash-out moments, and end-stage bonuses are introduced, the scoring gain becomes exponential. Exponential scoring systems typically come with harsher punishments for failure. Your chains might break, and your bonuses will reset or disappear. Linear scoring systems reflect the player's skill more holistically. They don't disproportionately punish mistakes during specific sections, or make some parts way too lucrative. They also minimize frustration. Linear systems let you recover from mistakes with exceptional performance later on. Meanwhile, exponential systems provide very high risk, very high reward. This can be very exciting and gives the games a strong one more try quality. They also offer very instant, clear feedback when the player is doing well or poorly. Sudden massive boosts of score are a good way to indicate that the player is doing something right. Both styles have their own pros and cons. Games are rarely one or the other as well. Mostly exponential systems often have limits, such as capped multipliers to create a more linear curve, while mostly linear games have little multipliers to add more room for optimization.
Positive versus negative systems.
Negative scoring systems are scoring systems that attack the player. Whenever you perform an action like killing an enemy or picking up an item, the games give you some kind of bonus and start a timer forcing you to continue certain actions in fear of losing said bonus. Being passive is massively punished. A good example of this is Dodonpachi's enemy chaining. Whenever you kill an enemy, it adds to your combo, but if you spend too long without killing enemies, it'll drop the whole combo entirely. So there's constant pressure on you to keep doing well. Positive scoring systems, on the other hand, is the player attacking the game. Extra score has to be actively earned by performing certain actions. The game does not pressure you into continuing combos. Being passive is just not rewarded. A good example of this would be Gigawing. You can reflect bullets, but the game doesn't pressure you to keep constantly reflecting them. It's up to you to make the most out of the system. Games exist on a spectrum between these two styles. Certain games like Gawange have strong positive and negative elements. Your chain is timed and it will drop if you don't kill enemies, but just killing enemies won't increase it very much. To increase it, you need to aggressively earn coins with cancels, milk bosses, and match the right shot type to the right enemy.
Depth versus clarity.
It may be tempting to go nuts with all kinds of multipliers, sub-multipliers, varied base values, several levels of resource management, and more to create as deep of a system as possible. This has massive downsides, however, because as you're increasing a game's mechanical complexity in order to maximize depth, you're making your system very hard to understand and preventing the player from forming a solid game plan. To somewhat alleviate this problem, games create a clear hierarchy of systems and goals, or limit depth by creating more clear, discrete states. So take for example the quick kill bonus. You could make it so that the bonus is determined by the exact amount of frames it took to kill the enemy, or you could make the quick kill bonus a binary state. Either you quick kill an enemy or you don't. As for the hierarchy, you need to emphasize the more important scoring elements visually, while making the less important ones more subtle. Scoring often tends to invert its risk versus reward dynamics. Instead of riskier and more complicated moves being more rewarding, they are often less rewarding. That way players won't get lost in the sauce too early. So basically just have a simple, easy to understand core layer to your scoring system, and then add a ton of nuances and ways to optimize things on top of that. Depth without much complexity is ideal, and certain games like Psyvariar achieve this wonderfully, but eventually you're bound to hit a wall and be forced to make the choice. Do you want your game's scoring to be easier to get into, or potentially offer more to players in the long term? This choice is for you to make, though it may not be a good idea to tie overly complex scoring systems into survival, unless your game looks and plays well enough to attract players in spite of its overcomplicated nature.
Common archetypes.
To finish off, let's look at some common scoring system archetypes found in shmups. Item pickup based scoring, a simple system where players try to pick up as many items as they can. Sometimes they can't pick up everything and have to prioritize. For example, Dragon Blaze. Timed pickups, a system where players have to time their pickups perfectly. For example, flashing coins in Psycho games, or waiting for the right power-up in GGLS 3. Stage end bonuses, a system that rewards players for certain things such as enemy destruction percentage, amount of bombs and lives left in stock at the end of levels. Sometimes the whole game has an endgame bonus. Max bonuses, a system where by hitting the bomb or power-up cap, the player either gets a score passively like in Dodonpachi, or after each subsequent pickup like in archetype. Enemy chaining. This is the famous Doronpachi system, where killing an enemy increases your multiplier, which gets applied to every subsequent kill, as long as the timer doesn't tick down. You have to keep killing enemies to preserve the multiplier. Medal chaining. This is very similar to enemy chaining, but applied to item pickups. Each subsequent pickup either directly gives you more points or builds your multiplier. Battle Garegga and Danganronpa are good examples. Grazing-based scoring. Touching a bullet with your sprite without having it hit your hitbox either gives you score directly or builds your multiplier. It can either be once per bullet or tick-based. Psy Warrior is a good example. Speed killing based scoring. The faster you kill an enemy, the more points you get, usually in the form of a speed kill bonus. Raiden 4 uses this system. Caravan style scoring, a different take on speed killing. Instead of enemies giving you more points directly, killing a wave forces the next one to spawn, so the quicker you kill enemies, the more of them will spawn and the more score you will get. Star Soldier games and Danganronpa are good examples of this. Proximity based scoring. The closer you are to an enemy when you kill them, the more points or resources you will get. Katsui S. Galuda and Mushihime-sama Futari do this. Bullet cancelling based scoring. Using special attacks, bombs, or just killing enemies cancels bullets on screen and turns them into points. S. Galuda is a good example of this, but many games do this. Reflect based scoring. This is very similar to cancel based scoring systems, but you suck up the enemy bullets and toss them back at the enemies. Mars Matrix is the go-to example of this. Hyper-based scoring. Hypers are special power-up states of your ship. When you're in them, you usually get more points somehow. There are a lot more archetypes, and games usually use a mix of them. So for example, as Galuda has proximity-based scoring, in that the closer you are to an enemy when you kill them, the more gems you get. It has special weapons, or like hyper-based scoring, in that you need to be in your special state to get more points. And it has cancel-based scoring, where if you kill an enemy, they'll cancel all their own bullets and convert them to point items. Oh, and of course it has very huge endgame bonuses as well. So play a lot of the games and think about how you want to implement this kind of stuff.